To wind up this afternoon's proceeding, very pleased to introduce Dr. Ian Mortimer, will be well known to you for a series of books, not only historical studies of Edward III and Henry IV, a very imaginative book on 1415, Henry V's Year of Glory, but also the Traveller's Guide to Medieval England, Tudor England, Elizabethan England.
Elizabethan,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Welcome, Ian. I'm very pleased to have you speak to me today in a more general fashion about the meaning of war.
Thank you, Anne. I've been thinking about this subject for a long time, so it's great to have an opportunity to say it publicly, and you can all throw something at me if you disagree, but ever since writing the medieval biographies, I felt that people receiving them often didn't receive them in the right way, or they didn't understand what medieval war was. And then writing recently about the last 1,000 years and the changes over the last 1,000 years in a book called Centuries of Change, which now confusingly is going to have a different title in paperback. It's going to be called Human Race when it comes out in October. I've got the impression that people really do think that quite a lot of the past was people like us running around in fancy dress. And they weren't like us. And therefore I've put a fair bit of thought into this, and I haven't got much time. This talk is an hour long, so I'll get on with it straight away. It's surely the greatest irony of civilization that the more we develop as a society, the greater our capability to destroy ourselves and our environment. Primitive man had very little power to kill his rivals in significant numbers, and had no means but overhunting and burning flora to wreck his habitat, whereas we all know that the complete annihilation of life on Earth is now within our power. The implication of this difference is that the nature and character of warfare has changed over the ages, so that what we mean by war today bears little resemblance to war in the pre-industrial past. Despite this, we publicly associate war with one of two moral positions. The first is that it's a calamity in every respect, and to be avoided at all costs, without exception. This was the view of the Renaissance scholar Erasmus. The second moral position is that war is a necessary evil, as Thomas More said, or, to quote the great 19th century theorist of war, Karl von Clausewitz, it's the continuation of policy by other means. This moral stance prevails when the policy in question suits us, for example, when we defended the Falklands in 1982. The problem with both of these moral positions, which are really the ends of a spectrum of necessity, is that they're both negative. The destruction of the last two world wars was so devastating that today we see all wars, even those at the necessary end of the spectrum, through the doom-tinted spectacles of the 20th century. The 1969 counterculture hit War by Edwin Starr, released at the height of concern about the war in Vietnam, encapsulates this view in its opening lyrics, which I'm sure you all know. War, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. However, this negativity is totally at odds with the thousands of texts written over the last 30 centuries glorifying war, applauding its strategies and championing its leaders. We simply do not acknowledge in public circles that war had very different meanings in past societies, and to reduce them all to moral positions on the spectrum of necessity is oversimplifying an enormously complex cultural phenomenon. This raises quite a lot of questions on the anniversary of Agincourt. Cicero said that a war is never undertaken by the ideal state except in defence of its honour or its safety. Can the Agincourt campaign be seen as part of a defensive war? Well, at first sight, no, but in some ways, which I will come to later on, it can. Can it be seen as an honourable war? That's a much easier argument. But if these things are true, should we not celebrate the battle? The organisers of this conference have carefully written that we are commemorating Henry's victory, wisely avoiding the recriminations of both those who steadfastly maintain that all war is evil and our French friends. However, the questions spinning off from just this one little nicety are many and complex. Is it always wrong to celebrate a military victory? Were the British wrong, for example, to celebrate the defeat of Hitler in 1945? I don't think so. So were they wrong to do so in 1946 and 1947? When does the period of celebration cease and that of commemoration begin? Clearly the meaning of a war, any specific war, changes as society changes. The reason why we could unequivocally celebrate the English victory at Agincourt in the 15th century and later, and yet today it would be in bad taste to say we are celebrating the conflict, has nothing to do with the battle and everything to do with us. The meaning of war changes not only with regard to the nature and character of the violence itself, but also with regard to the society which recalls its past conflicts. This talk is an attempt to look beyond the popular one-dimensional spectrum of necessity and to show how war is a multi-dimensional aspect of our culture that has changed enormously over time. Although you can define war in an absolute, non-relative way, to do so is a pretty meaningless exercise. It's the relative definition of war, in which the use of force is defined in relation to the society that enacts and experiences it, which gives it meaning. Hence, I intend in this talk to look at some of the changing facets of conflict in order to develop a framework for understanding the relative meaning of war since the Middle Ages. In particular, I want to look at the ways in which modern connotations of war inhibit our understanding of war in other times, with a particular emphasis on the public understanding of the virtues of late medieval warfare. This is a crucial point. You don't have to believe that there has ever been such a thing as a good war, but you must be open to such thinking in order to assess the wars of the past. If you start off with the predisposition that all war is a failure of humanity, like Erasmus, and even a just war is a necessary evil, you can never hope to understand the reasons why people start wars in the first place, or why people enthusiastically engage in ongoing conflicts. The nature of war. Most animals fight. During the course of writing this lecture, I went on a walk and saw two rabbits attacking each other so viciously that they were oblivious of my presence, even though the distance between us was barely 3 feet. Kicking and biting, they fell down a bank on the side of the lane through brambles and nettles, and one was screaming with such a sustained high-pitched squeal that I've never heard before from a rabbit. It struck me then how natural and common violence is, so much so that you can even see fighting between herbivorous animals, which are, more often than not, the prey of others. But rabbits do not gather in large armies to attack each other, despite what you read in Watership Down. Ants, chimpanzees and humans are the only species that do. There is therefore no avoiding the fact that we are an exceptionally violent bunch, and that is very unusual, but it is natural. From long before historic times, social groups carried out acts of hostility against other social groups, ranging from raids to full-scale conquests. As Thomas Hobbes first postulated in Leviathan, 1651, and as numerous modern studies have shown subsequently to have been true, war amongst primitive humans was the norm. This pattern of normalised warfare continued to historical times. Cast your mind back, if you will, to the year 871, when Athelred and Alfred of Wessex fought a series of battles against the Viking intruders. This was war, no shadow of a doubt about it, and yet there had been no declaration of hostilities. There had been no solemn announcement that the Wessex ambassador had passed a final note to the Viking ambassador, demanding that the Vikings immediately withdraw their troops from Wessex, and that, having failed to receive such an undertaking, a state of war now existed between them. The plain fact was that if a large number of tall, heavily armed foreign men came into your village and rushed at you wielding axes, you were at war. And when no notice of such an attack could be expected, your society had to be prepared for that to happen at any time, and thus at all times. 200 years later, things were hardly any different. Look at the Welsh and Irish annals from the 11th and 12th centuries. Almost every entry concerns one lord killing another, followed by the said lord being killed the next year by his victim's kin in revenge. William the Conqueror did make a limp attempt to justify his invasion of England within a Christian framework by referring to an oath that Harold is supposed to have made to him and broken. But it is very doubtful whether such an oath really was sworn, and frankly, it probably would not have made much difference in 1066 if it hadn't been. Things had changed by the 14th century, in England at least. In his campaigns in France and Scotland, Edward III was very particular to agree truces and not peace treaties, making an official distinction between his kingdom being in a state of peace, a state of war, and a state of suspended hostilities. Such a distinction remained the norm between these kingdoms and increasingly other kingdoms thereafter. In the early 16th century, Erasmus declared war to be stupid, his word not mine, and refused to admit there was any justification for it. All war leaders, according to him, were military idiots, thick-headed lords, not even human except in appearance. Such views were symptomatic of the very opposite of a society that had to be ready for war at all times. In 1504, an act of Henry VII forbade the retention of men who were not servants, thereby banning private armies. One can see physical manifestations of the decline of violence at this time in the number of lords who chose to live in unfortified manor houses rather than castles. In short, over the course of the Middle Ages, Europe went from society in which war was normal to one in which peace was normal. This fundamental trend has to be the starting point for our consideration of the changing meaning of war. It's necessary to see it in relation to the general argument that has emerged in recent years that over the broad sweep of time, mankind has become less violent, both as individuals and as a series of nations. The best known work dealing with this is Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, 2011. Pinker tries to explain why the rates of homicide in Europe declined from the Middle Ages, so that the likelihood of being killed in peacetime dropped from levels of around 45 per 100,000 in the 15th century to less than 1 per 100,000 by the mid-20th. He argues that this was due to a combination of what Norbert Elias called the civilizing process in his 1939 study of that name, and the authority of the nation-state, as put forward by Hobbes in Leviathan. Through a combination of the advantages of peace and the deterrence of the legal system, private violence declined. Pinker also addresses the process by which warfare became less fatal. Whereas primitive societies regularly saw mortality figures of 15% per year, nation-states in the 20th century did not experience as much as 1% per year mortality due to war, even during the crisis years of the two world wars. According to Pinker, the positive advantages of trade on the one hand and the threat of international law and its repercussions on the other meant that most states came to recognise the benefits of not pursuing aggressive foreign policies. Pinker's thesis is interesting, but it is only half the explanation of the decline of violence. We should also notice the matter of scale. Well, it's quite easy to see how one group of 10,000 people going to war with a much larger group can lose 15% of its population on one battlefield. It's far harder to see how a nation of 10 million people fighting another nation can lose 1.5 million except in a single year, except with the protracted or widespread use of nuclear or biological weapons, and neither of those has thankfully yet happened. In other words, the very size of modern populations slows down the rate at which killing can take place. But much more importantly, we should ask whether violence was ever eradicated by the legal authority of the nation-state. An absence of people attacking each other does not necessarily mean the violence has gone away. As I put it in Centuries of Change, let's say you've got a wonderful orchard in which the finest apples grow, so good that a number of your neighbours regularly steal them. After a while, you decide you cannot tolerate their thieving ways any longer, and you start to beat them with a stick when you catch them. Most desist, but a few carry on stealing, and so after a little while you lay in wait and strike the next thief over the head with a brick. The rest hear about this and stop their thieving ways, fearful of meeting you and your brick. What does this say about violence? When you were tolerating the theft, there was crime, but no violence. When you were taking limited action against the thieves with a stick, there was both crime and violence. Then the attack with the brick marked the apparent end of both crime and violence. The Pinker thesis would categorise the last stage as non-violent, for no one is beating anyone else. However, if there were no threat of violence, the thieves would return. What deters them is the possibility of violence on the level of you and your brick. The violence is still there, only it is there in a latent or a potential form. This argument, which was designed to show why it's important to consider force as a whole and not just enacted force or violence, can be applied at the level of the medieval kingdom and the modern nation state. You might say, for example, as many do, that it is the deterrent of nuclear war that has restricted large-scale conflict between Western powers since 1945. At the medieval end of our time scale, the potential force of a whole string of castles across a neighbouring land dissuaded many would-be conquerors from attacking on a large scale, restricting their activities to raids. Therefore, there are really two things going on within this great shift from war as normal to peace as normal. One is the decline of enacted force, and the second is the rise of latent or potential force. It goes without saying that there's an inverse correlation between the two. If the enacted force has diminished to a very low level, so little violence, it's because the ever-increasing potential force looms significantly over the heads of all would-be warriors. Of course, there are incentives to maintaining peace that must be taken into consideration also, such as the ability to trade freely. But it can hardly be denied that, in recent years, our readiness to go to war has decreased in proportion to the damage we are able to inflict on one another. War now acts as its own deterrent. That was not the case at the start of the Middle Ages. The personnel of war. In stating we've shifted from a state in which war is normal to one in which peace is normal, I have deliberately failed to note the one group for whom this is not true, namely those whose business is war. This was brought home to me forcefully at the age of 10, when my class at school was invaded by a retired admiral, the grandfather of one of my schoolmates. This venerable gentleman entered in military uniform and began his presentation with the following question: what is the purpose of peace? This flummoxed me, for I thought at that tender age that if anything had a purpose, it was war, and the purpose of war was to secure a lasting peace, not the other way round. But no, I shuddered at hearing that the purpose of peace is to prepare for war. I had a vision of an eternity of conflict stretching away, planned and delivered by venerable old men in dark blue suits with gold buttons and peaked white caps. But his justification then struck a chord. Unless you use peacetime to prepare for possible hostilities, victory will be that much harder to achieve when war breaks out. With the benefit of this piece of wisdom, it is easy to see how a decrease in enacted violence around the world has not been accompanied by a process of demilitarization. Leaders did not always build up their armed forces in order to make war, but in the hope of maintaining peace. In refining the model, it's not correct to say that every member of society simultaneously shifted from seeing war as normal to peace as normal, but rather a diminishing subset of the population continued to see war as a necessary and lifelong obligation. As most people will be aware here, in the early and high Middle Ages, society understood itself to be composed of three social groups: those who fight, including the king, those who pray, and those who work. On reflection, they really should have termed these three groups those who give commands, those who write them down, and those who do what they're told. For really, the whole community could be expected to share in a collective military responsibility. Over the course of the late medieval period, however, and especially in the years after the introduction of effective handheld firearms, the military outlook of all three social groups declined, including those who fight. And this has changed our whole perception of the meaning of war. Let's begin with those who fight. It is easy to find evidence of a positive attitude to war amongst members of this group in the Middle Ages. For example, think of jousting. I find it heartwarming to think that there was once a time when the political elite of the country gathered together to hammer 7 bells out of one another for the entertainment of the public. I relish the St Angelvert tournament of 1390 when for 40 days 3 French knights took on all comers, including the future King of England, Henry IV. I suspect that if our political leaders were serious in wanting to see greater public engagement with politics, there is no better way of bringing this about than if David Cameron, Boris Johnson and George Osborne were to don armour and to do battle with sharpened spears against all their political opponents in Hyde Park. Jousting is a good indicator of the degree to which the medieval political class identified with violence. You might think that jousting and war have little in common, jousting being merely codified and controlled violence for show in peacetime. But it was not always that way. The late medieval tournament began as a 12th century melee, in which large numbers of knights would fight each other within a specified area for the purposes of training for war, with fatalities being common. In 1241, 80 knights died in a single tournament at Neuss in Germany. Even in the 14th century, jousting was not without its serious military dimension. In December 1341, in the context of the Anglo-Scots War, Sir William Douglas and 12 of his men twice challenged the Earl of Derby and 12 of his men to jousts of war with sharpened steel lances. They agreed to fight on condition that no one wore any armour. Madness. The joust took place at Roxburgh and Berwick. I wish I could tell you how many were injured, but all I know is that on the second occasion there were 3 killed on the tournament field. The same bellicose spirit can occasionally be glimpsed in actual war. On the Crécy campaign in 1346, Sir Thomas Holland found the bridge between himself and the French king at Rouen had been destroyed. He was most upset. And having fought and killed the only 2 Frenchmen he could find, he stood on the edge of the ruined bridge and repeatedly bellowed St George for King Edward at the French on the other side. At the Battle of Crécy itself, John of Luxembourg, the blind king of Bohemia, asked to be led into the fray by his household knights so he could die in the thick of the fighting. And at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, Sir Giles d'Argentine is reported to have announced, "I am not accustomed to fleeing a battle. I choose to bide here and die rather than shamefully flee." And he promptly did so. Such men were bred to fight, trained to fight, and by God, they wanted to fight. And this positive attitude to war is understandable. These men held their privileged positions in society precisely because they fought. Their wives and daughters were also elevated above the common mass because their menfolk were the military leaders in society. Everyone in this group, the king, the nobility, and the knights of the realm, had no choice in being warriors. Those who prayed and those who worked expected it of them. But when guns came on the scene, this conjunction of military leadership, political authority, and social privilege fell apart. Regardless of whether or not you subscribe to the idea of a military revolution in the late 16th century, there was a gradual but definite division of political power and military command over the period 1500 to 1650. Sorry, I'm going to have a drink. I beg your pardon. Oh, that's better. Yeah. There was a gradual but definite division of political power and military command over the period 1500 to 1650. Increasingly, the king did not risk his own life on the battlefield, but rather delegated command to a senior nobleman. Richard III was famously the last English king to die in combat in 1485. James III of Scotland died in battle 3 years later. His son James IV was killed while commanding at Flodden in 1513. Francis I of France was captured at the Battle of Pavia in 1525, and Louis II of Hungary was killed in 1526 fighting the Ottomans. royal appearances on the battlefields of Europe after that grew even rarer. King Sebastian of Portugal perished at Alcázar el Kabir in Morocco in 1578, and in 1632 Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden became the last European king to die leading his troops in battle. In 1646, Charles I did not come within reach of the guns at Naseby, being firmly prevented from entering the battle at the head of his lifeguard. Although George II famously did take command at Dettingen in 1743, and Frederick II of Prussia and Napoleon Bonaparte were well known for their generalship, these were exceptional cases. On the whole, a head of state did not risk putting himself in a position of danger, and as monarchs departed from the battlefield, dividing political and military leadership, the nobility followed them into the political camp. A graph of English aristocratic male deaths shows a steady decline from 25% of noblemen dying violently in 1400 to 2.5% in 1750. Today, it would be very unusual for a peer of the realm or a multimillionaire property owner to have anything other than an honorific position in command of a regiment, let alone actually to die in combat. The professional soldiers who stepped into the gap left by political authority and hereditary title were different from their medieval antecedents. They were no longer a distinct social group privileged by society to defend the kingdom. Even though many military officers today do come from the ranks of the more privileged classes, ultimately they've chosen to be fighters, as opposed to being required to fight by society in return for their social privileges. The current Duke of Westminster, who, to the best of my knowledge, is the only living landowning peer to have commanded a regiment in the British Army, is no exception to this rule. He opted to assume the responsibilities imposed on the modern soldier by international organisations and conventions. It wasn't a requirement of his rank. But if all the medieval lords in the country had been deprived of the requirement to exercise feats of arms, they'd have lost one of their main raison d'etre as a class. They did not occupy their elevated positions in society on the strength of an option to go into battle, but rather on the expectation that they would, bringing a considerable number of knights with them. When considering those who fight, there's another huge difference between today's commanders and their medieval forebears. The officers have gradually withdrawn from the battlefield, in the same way that kings did in the period 1500 to 1650. Perhaps a stray bullet could have struck the Duke of Marlborough at Blenheim in 1702, or Wellington at Waterloo in 1815. But since 1915, aerial bombardment and other nondescript forms of mass killing, such as machine guns and gas attacks, have forced generals further and further back behind the front line. By the time of the Second Gulf War, in 2003, most of the senior military commanders were based in a different country from the field of operations. War today is increasingly a matter of displaced and attenuated control, in which the professional frontline warrior is often at a considerable distance from those who direct him. Indeed, it is essential for the commanding officers to remain a long way from the battlefield to avoid being drawn into the confusion of the destruction, capable of monitoring the situation across a vast sweep of ground. If a modern commander behaved anything like Sir Thomas Holland, killing random Frenchmen and yelling across the River Seine, he'd be certified, deemed unfit for duty and removed from his post. Although there were men who displayed a very positive association with war in the Second World War, from Mad Jack Churchill, playing his bagpipes as he went into battle, carrying a longbow and a Scottish broadsword, to the German pilots who were given the chance to go on extra bombing raids or to machine gun garden parties as rewards, we regard such antics as either eccentric or barbaric. Therefore, although the spirit of the warrior may occasionally flare up in a modern soldier in a way reminiscent of his passionately violent medieval ancestors, the medieval class of men and women for whom war was normal has entirely vanished. Today, those who fight are one and the same as those who work. The major difference between them and everyone else is that their work potentially involves killing other people and risking being killed. And it is easy for a non-combatant to see this element as not just dangerous, but abnormal. So much for those who fight. What about the remainder, the majority? In England, when war was normal for all, when war was normal for all, the collective duty to fight attackers was shared by the whole community. This found embodiment in the Saxon period. All men between the ages of 15 and 60 were expected to fight. This same expectation was emphasised in the Statute of Winchester in 1285, with that act laying down exactly what arms were to be borne by each male member of the community. As the Middle Ages progressed, the military readiness of ordinary men declined, but they remained much more militarily minded than modern civilians. Edward III famously reinforced this culture of readiness through his insistence on regular archery practice. Some of his writs to northern sheriffs contain instructions for 4,000 or 5,000 archers to be provided from each county. As we all know, this was not a passing phase. Regular archery practice only broke down in the 16th century. It was towards the end of this period, when Erasmus was castigating the very idea of war and handheld firearms were displacing political authority from the battlefield, that the ordinary man shrugged off the responsibility to fight. Although in England the militia was reorganised, with householders being required to support and participate in the trained bands, the impression was that the militia as a whole was poorly organised and ill-disciplined. Only the well-drilled London trained bands made much of an impact in the civil wars. The introduction of a standing army in 1660 lessened the need for the populace to be familiar with the methods of war. Reorganisations of the militia in 1662 and 1757 did not reverse the military weakness of English communities, and after the Napoleonic Wars, the militia ceased to function altogether. All this puts us at a distinct disadvantage in determining the meaning of war to past communities. The demilitarisation of society as a whole since the Middle Ages has eradicated the concept of a hereditary fighting force who need to fight to justify their privileges. It has left the professionals who fill that role increasingly isolated and in the minority. At the same time, when war can involve whole populations, the majority are, ironically, entirely inexperienced in military matters. And naturally we see war, as a threat to our everyday peaceful lives. On top of this, political authority has itself become demilitarised. Although the examples of Frederick II and Napoleon Bonaparte caused Clausewitz to declare that ideally war should be fought by the head of state in person, as only such men could combine in themselves political and military authority and disregard public opinion, even he could see in 1832 that few heads of state could be masters of both the political and the military arts. Today, monarchs can no longer disregard public opinion, nor can politicians. Active military leaders are specialists. If a prime minister sends you to war, he is not saying, "Follow me, lads," as part of a collective enterprise. He's commanding you to fight on the understanding that he is staying at home. Therefore, when historians write about war leaders, they are describing a group of people who are construed by a modern audience as being outside the parameters of normal behaviour. I might say fair behaviour too. These changing aspects of the personnel of war lead to multiple misunderstandings when talking about medieval and early modern conflicts. You can't reasonably argue that Henry V was not a warmonger. He agitated for war, he schemed, spied, prepared for and diplomatically engineered the War of 1415, and the political decision to invade France was ultimately down to him. But today, that word warmonger carries connotations of abnormality, and many people will infer that he was inhumane and perhaps barbaric. On the other hand, there are those who regard Henry as a hero, normally in the wake of Shakespeare's great play, and they consequently refuse to accept he could have deliberately started a war because he wasn't like that. Both of these errors, the over-negative judgment on him and the refusal to accept what he did, are fundamentally down to modern misunderstandings of the meaning of war. And while it may be possible for an academic specialist to set aside such assumptions and connotations, for the most part, his or her non-academic readers will have great difficulty doing so. The changing face of war. Now we come to the horror of war. In using that word horror, I'm referring to two things. On the one hand, I'm referring to the act of destruction itself, which normally entails killing large numbers of people. On the other, there is the awareness of it on the part of those who are horrified. Both of these things have changed beyond measure over the last 100 years. No one needs me to emphasise the deadliness of modern warfare. You only need to think of some of its icons of unprecedented destruction. Trench warfare on the Western Front in 1915 to 17, the use of chemical weapons from 1915, the Luftwaffe's Blitz of 1940 to 41, the firestorms consciously inflicted upon Hamburg and Dresden in 43 and 45, the use of Germany's V-1 and V-2 rockets, and the atomic bombs dropped by the US Air Force on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Beneath these events are the serried lines of weapons that mark off the modern world from what has gone before. A vast range of sophisticated handheld assault weapons, machine guns, flamethrowers, mines, bombs, missiles, torpedoes, tanks, fighter aircraft, chemical and biological weapons, submarines, aircraft carriers, drones, ICBMs and thermonuclear weapons. For all the talk of surgical strikes and preventing or minimising collateral casualties, the photographs of the charred bodies following a targeted missile raid on a compound or a vehicle convoy are profoundly shocking. The invention that enabled an exponential increase in the horror of war was that of heavier-than-air flight. No other single development has allowed one fighting force to do so much damage to another without immediate risk to itself. Moreover, nothing has facilitated so much indiscriminate damage. You cannot deliver a bomb, an atomic bomb of the size as that same size as that dropped on Hiroshima, by train. You cannot simultaneously distribute thousands of incendiaries by hand. While there has always been a degree to which civilians have been the victims of war, the nature of war since 1915 has involved the massacre of men, women and children on a scale that previously required war to be conducted in conjunction with famine. In addition, the sufferings we are capable of inflicting on combatants and non-combatants alike have increased in scope and grotesqueness. The list of atrocities that man can inflict on man is one to which you can only add new items. You can never remove any. The slightly less obvious point is our heightened awareness of these atrocities. You don't need further details about those mentioned because you've seen the pictures. Indeed, it could be argued that the invention of the camera is second in importance only to that of the airplane in heightening the horror that we associate with war. Prior to the introduction of photography, it was difficult to convey the reality of mass human destruction except by personal communication, and few soldiers had both the descriptive powers and the motive to convey the full brutality of what they had witnessed. However, in the wake of the First World War, and especially the 1930s, so through such publications as the Daily Mail's Covenants with Death, people could see for themselves what a First World War battlefield looked like. In 1934, if you wish to, you could buy this publication and see for yourself what half a young woman blown apart in an air raid on a maternity hospital looked like, complete with the charred remains of her newborn baby. Or what dead troops looked like in the trenches. Or what a pretty female soldier, Russian soldier, looked like after she'd been captured, raped, shot dead and flung into a pit with a number of other bodies. And although the motive in publishing these pictures was to dissuade the public from ever supporting a war again, the sad fact is that the opportunities to circulate visual evidence of man's inhumanity to man increased exponentially over the subsequent decades. This greater awareness of the horror of war tends to distort our assumptions about what conflict was like beforehand. We contrast the utter horror of modern war with our peace-filled quotidian normality, and we're appalled. But medieval methods were not as brutally indiscriminate as modern ones. Moreover, when we contrast war and peace, they are further apart in the modern world than they were in the Middle Ages. As mentioned above, medieval peacetime was not that much more peaceful than war. medieval society was unspeakably violent compared with ours. The homicide rate in 14th century Oxford was at times the same as that of Dodge City at the height of the Wild West. No exaggeration, with adult murder rates in excess of 150 per 100,000 per year. Moreover, even when not murdering each other, people were exceedingly cruel. In a society where the short arm of the law was slow, inefficient and corrupt, and people were protected by powerful men, and there was almost no way of detecting the perpetrator of a crime after the event, it was a case of every man for himself. Fights were frequent, solutions to arguments. This undercurrent of violence carried through to the beating of women and children, the punishment of malefactors This undercurrent of violence carried through to the beating of women and children, the punishment of malefactors in ways that are quite simply nauseating, and the regularised torture of animals. In the late 16th century, peacetime punishments included the straightforward hanging of felons, hanging and evisceration of traitors, the burning alive of heretics and female traitors, including husband murderers, beheading with an axe if you were a traitorous nobleman, guillotining if you happened to live in Halifax, and slowly crushing to death under 700 weight of stones if you refused to plead in court. In Henry VIII's reign, you could also be executed by being boiled to death if you poisoned someone with your cooking. And this was in a country that prior to the reign of Elizabeth I prided itself on its absence of torture. In 1599 there was still a forest of poles on top of Tower Bridge bearing the skulls of beheaded traitors. In short, peace wasn't that peaceful, and war was nowhere near as indiscriminate and as deadly as a 20th century bombing raid. Our preoccupation with the horrors of modern war leads us into another unconscious error when evaluating war in the past. This is that because it is so sudden and extreme, we assume that war is always prosecuted to the full, and that any one side will do whatever it can to win, regardless of conventions, regulations, rules, and codes of conduct. Clausewitz, writing in 1832, makes this key distinction between a war in which you plan to drag your enemy to the negotiating table and a war in which you plan to annihilate him. In reality, annihilation was not a common feature of medieval warfare, the wars of Genghis Khan in the early 13th century being a notable major exception. Wars tended to be conducted in the moral environment of ecclesiastical restrictions and secular chivalric codes, as we've heard. The peace of God and the truce of God were early attempts to control the intermagnate violence of the 11th century. In medieval kingdoms, those who fought had to respect their equivalent high-status rivals on the opposite side and to ransom them if they were captured, not kill them. Although the modern tendency is to pour scorn on the codes of chivalry of the Middle Ages, such an attitude says as much about us as it does about them. Chivalry clearly did play a part in civilising patterns of conflict. In 1513, the Scots gave 1 month's advance notice in writing of their intention to invade the north of England. And when the two armies met at Flodden, it was with banners held high. This is in stark contrast with modern warfare in which stealth and shock are important tactical tools. We can see the effects of chivalry also in the medieval ordinances issued in the 14th century for the conduct of the army in France. These were repeatedly renewed and reissued throughout the 15th century. In the 16th century, we regularly come across references in Shakespeare's plays to mercy, sparing, and honour. Chivalric concepts were clearly accepted as normal behaviour. Ordinances of war continued to have currency in the 17th century. The new model army received a series of laws and ordinances of war in 1642. The military code of 1666 was based on this, and thus it became the foundation for the later rules of engagement for the British Army. In all wars, such laws and codes were undoubtedly more idealistic than enforceable. Nevertheless, they were at least aspired to. Chemical and atomic weapons, minefields and firestorms do not aspire to anything. They certainly do not understand the word mercy. With regard to the Agincourt campaign, we have considerable evidence that a high moral standard was expected of the men, as evidenced by the hanging of a man who stole from a church. The bottom line is that a series of regulations that prohibits looting, the murder of prisoners, the raping of women, the despoliation of churches, and the killing of children and peaceful civilians, is a far more humane approach than that of obtaining victory at all costs, or the unprincipled action of killing as many civilians as possible by dropping high explosives on their cities. The religious framework. A fourth way in which the meaning of war has fundamentally changed is the loss of the religious element in the Western world, at least. Medieval men and women looked on warfare as delivering a divine verdict on an earthly dispute. Hence, when William the Conqueror defeated the Saxons at Hastings, it could be deemed a divine judgment on Harold for breaking his oath to William, as mentioned above. Repeated victories in France allowed Edward III's contemporaries to compare him to Jesus for the level of divine approbation he received, in marked contrast to the French Pope's inability to deliver victory to the French. In the 15th century, the religious propaganda implied by victory in battle reached new heights. Henry IV did not fight a battle against Richard II in 1399, being elected almost unopposed as Richard's successor in Parliament. However, after his popularity waned, he found he had no choice but to defend himself in arms. He gathered an army and defeated the rebels led by Henry Percy at Shrewsbury in 1403. The victory was seen as a sign that God approved of Henry's assumption of the crown in 1399 and his subsequent kingship. Just as William the Conqueror built a church on the site of his victory at Battle, near Hastings, so Henry built one at Shrewsbury, marking the site of a divine judgment in his favour with a permanent religious edifice. Thereafter, the Lancastrians made a point of using war to justify their occupation of the throne. As I've argued in various places and publications, Henry V engineered the war in France in 1415 in continuation of his father's unexecuted plan to demonstrate the right to be kings in England and France through military victory in France. It was a brilliant idea in theory. Without fighting a war on English soil or damaging English interests in any way, the king could demonstrate God's judgment in favour of the Lancastrian dynasty. Only the French suffered, and then only in those places through which the armies actually passed. The drawback was that victory after victory was required to guarantee the dynasty's legitimacy, and sooner or later the victories were bound to run out. Sure enough, when Gascony finally fell to the French in 1453, it was only 2 years before what we might call the War of the English Succession, 1399 to 1487, shifted onto English soil in the form of the Wars of the Roses. The religious dimensions of war became even more important in the 16th century. If you were a Dutchman and a firm believer in the teachings of Martin Luther in 1566, you were bound to see the outcome of your struggle against an army summoned by a Catholic king of Spain as representing divine will. You might even have understood the long and drawn-out nature of the conflict as a test of faith. In England, the defeat of the Armada was of seminal importance in this respect. In the early part of Elizabeth's reign, there was widespread doubt that England had done the right thing by breaking from Rome. In 1564, fewer than half of all the magistrates in the country, had sworn the oath of allegiance, recognising Elizabeth the supreme governor of the Church of England. In 1570, the Queen was found guilty of heresy by the Pope and excommunicated. Thus, when an English fleet, aided by an unexpected and seemingly divine wind, defeated the Armada, there was no doubt how this victory was to be interpreted. God had decided in favour of the Protestant English over the Catholic Spanish. Elizabeth's kingdom acquired a new cultural confidence overnight. Whereas before there was doubt, afterwards you have madrigals, airs, plays and poetry that far surpass anything written before 1588. And you start to see references to the Queen as Gloriana. It was a divinely ordained victory that allowed England to bask in her brief golden age. In the 17th century, war declined rapidly as a means to determine the will of God. I suspect that part of the reason was due to the withdrawal of kings from the battlefield noted above. If a king is on the battlefield and he loses, it's easy to make the connection between his defeat and the will of God. If the king is not on the battlefield, but his appointed general loses, that connection is harder to make. It could be incompetence that cost the general the battle, not God's will. Indeed, in such circumstances, a king would be wise to make the general a scapegoat rather than admit that God might have decided against him. Another part of the reason was a similar decline of belief in divine intervention throughout all parts of society. In the sphere of medicine, for example, English accounts show that those afflicted by a fatal illness or injury in 1600 only sought medical help in 5% of cases. For them, Christ the physician was the only succour they needed. By 1670, 70 years later, well over 50% were paying for medical interventions, and the physicians themselves were seen as the conduits for divine healing power. By 1700, the divine element had largely been replaced by confidence in the professional abilities of the physician. Thus, faith in health shifted from God to the professions. It was much the same with soldiering. The causes of victory and defeat were traced to good and bad generalship, morale and preparation, not the will of God. The reasons for fighting. Modern wars break out for a limited number of reasons, mostly to do with a perceived threat to a nation, its sphere of influence or its economy, or a similar threat to one of its allies, or because a nation sees an opportunity to annex some land, which would be to its advantage, either symbolically or practically, or because a cultural group that is subsumed within a larger nation seeks to assert its independence. Few modern conflicts do not fall into one of these categories. Tensions between rival ethnic groups that erupt into civil war after years of peaceful cohabitation are more often than not triggered by perceived threats. As a result, we tend to overlook the fact that war regularly broke out in the past for different reasons, including the values inherent in the very act of fighting. Let's begin by concentrating on the period when war was normal, when you had every chance of running into a war band or a raiding party. Viking raids in the 9th and 10th centuries, Christian raids into Muslim Spain in the 11th, 12th and early 13th centuries, medieval Scots forays into the north of England throughout the whole medieval period, and English reprisals north of the border. All of these were undertaken in the spirit of testing the mettle of those taking part. If you have an identified enemy, then raids on that enemy constitute a test of manhood, a form of training in war, and a rite of passage for the young warrior. Moreover, in order to gain that experience, if you do not have an enemy, you have to attack your own compatriots. This, of course, was possible in the tournament, but killing 80 of your fellow trainees tends to be somewhat counterproductive. In other words, in order to train your cadre of those who fight so that their potential force is maximised, they need to practice by raiding. In this context, the raiding wars of, say, the Scots into England in the 14th century weren't just jabs at the English lion's rump and not just patriotic declarations of Scottish independence. They were valid means by which the fighting corps gained experience and increased the military deterrent of their nation. Certain kings were able to escalate this raiding as training to a full-scale war against their neighbours. When applied to the whole kingdom, the strategy incorporated many further advantages. The clearest examples are Edward III's campaigns. When he came to the throne in 1327, Edward had been instructed in Walter de Milmete's treatise De Nobilitatibus Sapientiis et Prudentiis Regum that his highest priority was to stop the fighting amongst his magnates. The previous reign had been characterised by just such a series of conflicts, resulting in a brief civil war in 1322, the execution of several earls for treason, deep discontent with the king's administration, and ultimately the collapse of the government and the replacement of the king. After Edward III took de facto power in 1330, he pursued a policy of international raiding on the scale of invasions. Assisted by the remarkable development of the mass use of the bow at the Battle of Duplin Moor in August 1332, he led an onslaught on the Scots in 1333 that culminated in the routing of a larger Scottish army at the Battle of Halidon Hill. Thereafter, by making war the business of government, initially through a series of campaigns in Scotland and later a number of campaigns in France, he practically curated the mass use of the English bow. He not only forced English archers to develop their technique, He did that same with English gunners. He developed the first gun emplacements at Calais, Dover and Queenborough to provide permanent bastions of safety for English troops. Military leaders were given real wartime experience in both Scotland and France. And Edward's policy of chivalric encouragement, Arthurian encouragement, spurred them on to new heights and aspirations of greater dignity. He also built up the English naval potential and put the sailors through the paces on more than one occasion, winning significant naval victories at Sluys 1340 and Winchelsea in 1350. Through this programme of militarisation, including a series of demonstrative wars, he did exactly what Walter de Milmeat had requested and stopped domestic conflict. All the violent energies of the magnates were put towards fighting England's enemies. By the standards of his own time, Edward III achieved more for England than any other leader before or since. However, his name did not feature as one of the greatest 100 Britons of all time in the BBC poll in about 2003. Henry V, you might be interested to know, came 72nd. One ahead of Aleister Crowley. Perhaps if Shakespeare had produced a decent play about Edward III and put some memorable words in his mouth, he might have stood a chance. But as it was, the changing meaning of war doomed him. By 1900, he was lambasted as a king who forced conflict on his own people in order to fulfil his own imperial ambitions, which were thwarted, and he was thus utterly devoid of greatness. However, the peace and prosperity that England enjoyed in the years 1330 to 1377 were a godsend to the kingdom after the turbulence of 1307 to 1330. Indeed, it is through Edward III that we can glimpse one of the most startling hypocrisies of the modern world. The peace we enjoy today, which allows us to deplore the actions of a medieval king, depends heavily on the potential force of our government, which, if it were to be deployed, would cause immeasurably more suffering than all of that which can be laid at the door of Edward III or any other medieval Christian king. Conclusion. You'll be glad to know I'm getting near the end. In the first line of his book, War and the Liberal Conscience, Sir Michael Howard says, "It is likely that ever since the origins of human society, men, or at least some men and most women, have intermittently lamented the existence of war." I would not dream of disagreeing with such an eminent historian of war, and I agree with him in this respect. I'm sure there has never been a time when a state of war was wholly to the liking of every member of a community. But I'm equally sure that there was a time when war was so much a part of everyday life that most men and women simply lived with it, and they did not lament it more than they lamented plague, pestilence, frosts and flooding. In the Middle Ages, plague and harvest failure were far deadlier than war. And since war did exist, there was no particular point lamenting it. Yes, the loss of a loved one in a war was a tragedy and the cause of great lamenting. But so too was the loss of a loved one from disease, starvation, or an accident. To the ever-practical medieval mind, lamenting the existence of war was rather like lamenting the existence of winter. Just as winter came around inevitably and was best put to use in whatever ways were possible, so the key to limiting the damage inflicted by war lay in turning it to your advantage, and that is what everyone did as so far as they were able. This is why war was as much a positive force in late medieval society as a negative one. If you allowed yourself to become the victim of war, your borders were vulnerable. Your neighbours could exercise their troops and grow strong at your expense, and always their gains would be to the detriment of your people. If, on the other hand, you had an aggressive an aggressive policy yourself, and kept the pressure up on your neighbours, so that your troops' raiding and practical training were always at your enemy's expense, then you didn't have to worry so much about defending your own borders. An aggressive policy imbued with great potential force was thus a necessity. And the best way of securing that policy and the necessary force was for society to be organised around a military nobility that was always prepared for war, and which was bred and trained to fight. Security, prosperity, and honour were the rewards for the people whose king could lead his magnates, their followers, and soldiers successfully into battle. Vulnerability, financial hardship, and humiliation were the alternative fates that awaited the people whose king was hesitant or unsuccessful in war. Since the late Middle Ages, the balance between the positive and the negative perceptions of war has swung entirely towards the negative, so that all sides are seen as losers. With regard to Agincourt, it is as if we are trying to judge what happened that day by peering at the battlefield through the fog and earth-seizing blasts of modern war. But this is all wrong. War has almost entirely been reinvented. If we wish to understand the meaning of war in respect to the society of 1415, we have to observe that Henry V was a young, able-bodied man of whom the people of England expected martial things. He had grown up just like Edward III in his father's troubled reign and had seen firsthand the danger in which the monarchy found itself when it did not proceed on an aggressive basis. If Henry had not opted to fight, it would sooner or later have been his territories that would have been attacked. Gascony by the French and Northern England by the Scots. His answer was to do his duty. He had to send a message of military strength abroad, to train his men in actual combat, and to answer the question raised by his father about God's will by demonstrating victory against a significant enemy. The real casualties of his campaign ran into hundreds on the English side and thousands on the French. In terms of stabilising the rule of his realm, this was a small price to pay, far smaller than the mass atrocities required in similar campaigns in the 17th century and later. Many of his men welcomed the war, as it gave them a chance to profit, to leave their homes and gain new experiences abroad, behaving with freer licence than they could at home, and in some cases it allowed them to fulfil their military duties and to achieve honour. Yet they were still bound by chivalric codes and religious ties. The concept of absolute war didn't exist. Nor was the contrast between war and peace anything like as vicious as it was in the 20th century. As a result of all the changes we have experienced, it is difficult for men and women today to sympathise with the positive warrior mentality of the late Middle Ages. It is thus even harder to reconcile famous victories with our values in the modern world. Should we celebrate the English victory at Agincourt? No, of course not, for we are not medieval. Nor should the Scots celebrate Bannockburn for the same reason. The sins of the father should not be visited on the sons, and nor do the sons have the right to celebrate their father's glories. But these conflicts need to be commemorated, for they are part of the very fabric of our culture. For war never came to an end. Instead, in Europe, we have found ways of continuing war by other means, to paraphrase Clausewitz. But it is due to the processes of medieval war that today we have nation-states, and we have democratic institutions holding governments to account, and we have international law. And when one realises this, and looks back across the last millennium to the time when war was normal, you have to consider that what I declared at the start of this talk was surely the greatest irony of civilization, that as we develop, we enhance our powers of self-destruction, is actually far from certain. I'm particularly mindful of Erasmus's hatred of war and its echoes in the 20th century. It is possibly an even greater irony that war has contributed directly to the discovery of our own humanity.
We've got a few minutes left for questions, but the conference delegates must be across in the dining area at about past or just after. So, would the Insbury kindly agree to take any comments or questions?
They all want their supper.
Or indeed, we're really impressed. These are eternal questions, Ian, aren't they? And indeed, just to say that the Agincourt 600 committee has had a big problem over this, and that's why the word commemorate is being used rather than celebrate in this, and that the French, there will be a monument put on the battlefield on the 25th of October, and it will be to the dead of both sides who have no grave. And that, of course, is heavily influenced by the First World War, which is surely a huge influence on our views on war today. And the commemorations on the 25th of October are going to be a replication of what happened in 1915 on the battlefield when we were allies of the French, when the French invited the British and shook hands over this area of turmoil. I mean, perhaps that's a question for me, if nobody else has said that. Well, how influential is the First World War on us today?
I mean, indiscriminate forms of killing. I always think, all the way through writing this, I had two thresholds in mind. One is I know it's unfashionable to talk in terms of the 16th century military revolution now, but that still is very much uppermost in my mind. When guns really did take over and political authority did withdraw from the battlefield. Yeah. There's one threshold, 1915. I used to live in Stoke Newington, the same square in which the first bombs were dropped in 1915. There's a blue plaque and what was a pub there. And every day walking past that thinking, there's such a shock to the Victorian pride and the Edwardian idea of progress and what do we do with this progress. And the modern world is horrific. That we can't get away from that. But going back to the idea of commemorating, I think it's totally right, and I think it would be wrong in this day and age for people to confuse these things. I'm reminded of is it Ray Fiennes? Who is it that wrote the book on Agincourt about his ancestors?
Yes,
yeah, and he talks about his ancestors all the way through. Well, I reckon that most people must be descended from those people by now. They've got so many of 600 years. Those people who survived Agincourt who had descendants, I've got an awful lot of descendants now. And I think if you look back at how many ancestors you have alive in the year 1415, how many of them were, you'd find quite a few of them would be on the other side of the channel from wherever you come from. We do not live in compact, isolated breeding boxes in which there is no transfer. We live in a society which has so much exchange, so much interchange, that we can't think in these narrow-minded, Erasmus was right, stupid boxes of nationalism, one nation against another. It doesn't make any sense to me for people to think like that. But we do need to recognise that these things did have meaning in the past and are part of the evolution of our sense of Englishness.
That's a good point. But if you feel you have an ancestor, or even if you don't, I would like to alert you to the fact that there is a service in Westminster Abbey on the 29th of October. And that is the day the news of the victory was received in London in 1415. It will be advertised, as all of these services are, in the Times from at least the 1st of September, and it's admission by application for tickets to Westminster Abbey. But I think it would be lovely, to share in this event. We will be having the lessons read by French and English, and there will be royal presence at it as well. So if you wish to share in this very special anniversary year, please do have a look out for that. And in the meantime, find your ancestors. But again, Ian, many, many thanks for ending the day, and thanks to all of you who have come. Please keep looking out for the lifelong learning activity that the Faculty of Humanities will be organising for the following academic year starting in October. We have a number of Saturday study days, some short courses, and also quite a number of language courses. So if you want to brush up your French so that you can go to France, and there is a Manière de Langage, a learning French book around 1415 that gives you a mock conversation saying, I hear our king has just won a great battle. So maybe learning French would be useful. Many thanks again, Ian.
Thank you very much.